Then the trees fell, and the trees fell, one by one, 20 in a day. Nothing could stand in my box.
From the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, much of life in Michigan centered around big woods, lumberjacks, sawmills, and lake shipping. As time boy, head bookkeeper, and later owner of the Chicago Lumber Company, my grandfather Will Crowe was a first-hand observer.
When I landed at Manistee from the Goodrich Line steamer on May 29, 1893, I was only 17 and had lived for 2 years on a cattle ranch on the treeless plains of eastern Colorado. I had never seen a lumbering camp, a sawmill, or even a big tree.
He walked out to Indian Lake through groves of white pines so tall they blotted out the sun and there was no undergrowth. He looked out across the lake and saw it filled from bank to bank with white pine logs rafted up for the run down the Indian River to the sawmills.
I believe there were no more colorful or interesting segments of American life than the lumber industries, nor a more picturesque individual than the old-time lumberjack and river driver.
Logging and river drive camps were identified by number and also by name of the foreman. The Chicago and Western lumber companies typically ran 9 camps per season. One who worked in the lumber camps remembered the first thing they always asked was, "Who's the cook?" Cookhouse rules were strict and strictly enforced. The men and women worked 6 long days a week. These Swedish and German loggers at a camp on the Ogontz River in Delta County made music on their Sunday day off. Every camp made its own World's Fair log load. The World's Fair log load was a load of giant white pines made up near Ewan in Ontonagon County and exhibited at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where the loggers unloaded and reloaded it every day for the entertainment of visitors. Crowe has a tale of a visit to one of these logging camps.
Frank Cookson and I went up to Shingleton on the Haywire Railroad to inspect a large cedar contract. We walked on snowshoes 7 miles, arriving at number 1 camp about dark. The deep snow clung in the most unbelievable shapes, and everywhere the gigantic toadstools and enormous snowcaps on the stumps.
Expert 3-man crews cut the trees down, limbed them, and sawed them into logs of 16 feet where possible. Men and horses would skid the logs out of the woods to the logging roads created overnight by large ice sleds. Immense loads of logs would be piled on sleighs and hauled by horse or oxen teams to the riverbank to be driven down in the spring. Oxen were first used for hauling loaded sleds out of the woods and on the iced logging roads. Horse teams gradually replaced the oxen, and later mechanical means were developed to bring out the logs. Spring river driving was tough. When the logs piled up in a huge mass, the river hogs, as they were called, would go out with their peavies to release the key log. When this log was freed, the water and the logs roared down the stream, and it was a wild scramble to safety for the river driver. To prepare meals for the crews, the drives were usually followed in a wanagon, a large raft with a tar paper shack that had a stovepipe sticking out of the roof. Driving logs up to 6 feet in diameter down a small stream relied on earthen and log dams built by men and horse teams. Water from the dams upstream would be released before the logs were put into the river.
Cribs in the river were made of very large logs, bolted together at the corners and filled with heavy rocks. They extended above the water to back up the booms. A boom was a string of long logs chained together end to end, which floated on the water and controlled the logs coming down the river so that the drivers could read the log marks and send the logs into the proper channel for each mill.
Many different log marks, some quite fanciful, were used throughout Michigan. The big sawmills of the white pine era in Michigan were almost all located on deep water on the Great Lakes, usually at the mouth of a stream. Mills were located at the mouth of almost every navigable river. The Menominee River had 43 mills at one time. Logs along Lake Superior not milled locally were gathered into huge booms and rafted to Pequaming and Hancock from as far away as Grand Marais, a float of 150 miles along the south shore of Lake Superior.
Sawmills of the time used either double-band steam saws or gang saws. A band saw is a steel belt with teeth on one edge. The logs were fed to it by a carriage shuttling back and forth at 2 miles a minute. It cuts only one board at a time, but very fast. A gang saw is a rack of large saws that cuts only on the downstroke, the saws being spaced to cut lumber of the thickness desired. The gang saws cuts the entire log, or cant, in one operation, but turns a lot of timber into sawdust.
The white pine lumber was piled on the docks and then onto sailing ships for transport to many lake ports. From the summer of 1863, when the first lumber schooner dropped anchor off the mouth of the river, the waterfront was a scene of great activity. For about 30 years, all freight and passenger traffic in and out was by water.
I once counted 29 lake boats alongside 18 lumber schooners tied up in the harbor in the slips. One evening I saw 3 schooners put out in a race for the Chicago market, and the setting sun on their sails was a beautiful sight.
Lumber schooners like the Quick Step of Michigan City, Indiana, sailing out of Ontonagon Harbor in 1912, were called lumber hookers and were designed for shallow water operations. They carried rocks or iron when empty to provide ballast.
In the spring, the Indians sailed a fleet of their Mackinaw boats over from Beaver Islands. These 2-masted open boats were very seaworthy, and the Indians were excellent sailors.
The time of the lumberjack in the woods and the whitewater man on the rivers lasted almost 100 years. Beginning with the coast of Maine, it moved across the country to the rugged western coast. Look for the giant white pine stumps left from the lumbering and wildfires. And look for remaining large white pine trees and groves, links to the years when the woods and rivers echoed to the shouts of the river drivers and the sound of the saws.
Fell one by one, 50 in a day. Nothing could stand in my box saw's way, and the trees fell. Their souls went to heaven, but my soul still too early to tell. Maybe heaven, maybe hell, but it's much too early to tell.
New 70th Anniversary Edition of Lumberjack, Insight and Era in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, by William S. Crowe, editors Lynn, McGlothlin, Emerick, and Anne McGlothlin Weller. Ask your bookseller or purchase on Amazon.com. Choose your edition: hardcover, paperback, ebook, audio, iTunes or Audible. Learn more at lumberjackbook.com. A unique first-hand story of a lumberjack.